Hello and welcome to my channel. This is my charcoal pencil drawing of Martin Freeman as Bilbo Baggins in The Hobbit. I'm going to show you how I did it. Let's have a look. I'm going to start with some vine charcoal and I'm going to be working on the background a little bit. I'm going to put my reference in the description if you want to check it out, because I had to make some changes to the composition and to the background. I essentially had to move Bilbo closer to the center of the paper, and I had to add some foliage in the top left just to balance out the background a little bit. I didn't really like the background that much, and I didn't like Bilbo's position, so I decided to make these changes. And of course I use this vine charcoal to draw the foliage, because I find that this is a very quick and easy way to draw trees and foliage. I worked over that a little bit with some blending tools, and because vine charcoal is so easy to manipulate, it'll be easy for me to blend that with my brushes and make it a bit softer and less defined if I want to, or take away a bit of value from it if I feel that it's too dark, once I make a little bit more progress on the main subject and the other elements of the drawing. So these are some of the decisions I can make a bit later. Now I'm starting to work on the central part of the drawing, but before I continue with the drawing process, I just want to say a few words about the materials. I'm using Kohinoor charcoal pencils, Kohinoor extra soft charcoal pencils and Kohinoor silky black pencils. Those are the pencils I'm using, and the silky black pencils are a little bit harder, and I'm using them for some of the details and some parts of the shading process, as well as cleaning up some of the edges and things like that. In addition to these charcoal pencils, I'm also using vine charcoal, and of course I'm going to be using some erasers and some blending tools. For erasing, I'm going to be using a kneaded eraser and a Kohinoor pencil eraser. For blending, I'm going to be using tortillons and brushes, various brushes. So I added another bush here to the left. I'm also adding a few touches of darker value to it using a charcoal pencil, because charcoal pencils are a bit darker than vine charcoal, especially when you start applying the brush. You can easily lift up a bit of that vine charcoal and make it lighter in the process. This is something that I'll use to my advantage when I start doing the the right side of the background rather. I added a few more bushes here in the background just to make the background a little more interesting, but I don't really need to try to define every single detail there. Just a bit of grass and some bushes and a bit of foliage in the background. I want it to look like Bilbo is in his garden smoking his pipe. He is smoking his pipe and he is making a funny expression while he is doing it. So normally when you draw portraits, you want to avoid distortions and asymmetrical faces here. That's just the way it is in the reference. So I'm going to have to make it asymmetrical, and I'm going to have to make his face kind of crooked to one side. I added a bit more background above his head. Obviously I need that value in the background there, just so that I could create some contrast with the lighter portions of his head. The light is coming from above, so the top of his head and the hair on the top of the head is going to be a lot lighter than on the sides, and I'm going to try to reflect that with the amount of value that I'm going to put down once I start working on the hair. The hair is going to be a little bit tricky. One of the first things I did was to sharpen my pencil and try to define some of the darker bits in between some of these segments of hair. And his hair is pretty long and messy, with a lot of these flyaway hairs and segments kind of growing and flowing every which way and overlapping and twisting. So this is the kind of hair that is a little bit difficult to draw, and I started out by just trying to explain the shape of the hair by defining some of the darker areas or shadow areas in between some of the larger segments of the hair. After that, I started pushing the charcoal around, trying to establish some sort of a base tone or base value, and also to be able to start working on these highlights on the top of the head. For the highlights, I'm going to use this Kohinoor pencil eraser, and I can use that in the same manner that I use a pencil. So here, in this stage, I wasn't really sure whether I was going to make the background a little bit darker, but I just wanted to pull a few highlights just to see how that'll work. And then I started drawing some more lighter areas in between these segments. And then I decided to do a bit more work on the hair using a vine charcoal stick, because I thought if I make mistakes or if I want to erase something, it'll be easier than if I did that with a charcoal pencil, which is a lot more difficult to erase actually. So I ended up doing most of the work on the hair using vine charcoal rather than a charcoal pencil. You can do a lot of work when you're doing portraits. You can do a lot of work with vine charcoal or willow charcoal, because it's so easily manipulated and blended, and of course it's also easily erased. But the problem with it is that some of its advantages are also its disadvantages at the same time, because it's so easily moved. It can get spoiled or ruined very easily. It can get smudged very easily, and in that process of moving it around, you can sometimes make some areas which are supposed to be darker, you can make them unintentionally a lot lighter than you wanted them to be. So it takes a bit of time to adapt to the messiness of vine and willow charcoal. But here I was able to achieve a nice contrast between the background, between those trees in the back and the top of Bilbo's head. A really nice contrast, which is what I wanted. I wanted the light side of his head to really stand out in contrast against that background. And of course I used that pencil eraser and its advantages to draw some of these flyaway hairs here and there to make the hair look extra messy and more natural looking. After that, I just continued defining some of the shadow areas in between segments of the hair, and once I was mostly happy with the left and the top part of the head or the hair, I was ready to move on to the face and facial features. The trick here, or the tricky bit here, are probably, well, there are several of them actually, not just the eyes but the mouth as well, because his eye on the left appears smaller than the one on the right, because he's kind of cocking his head to one side and he's twisting his mouth to one side as he is smoking his pipe. So he's making kind of a funny, slightly goofy expression here. This was a commissioned drawing, and I wasn't really sure if this was the best choice of a reference photo, but I decided to go with it, and it turned out okay. So once I draw some of the darkest bits on the face, like for example some of the darker details on the eyes, the eyebrows, the mouth, things like that, I will shade the face. But here I decided to define the pipe a little bit, with the lower part of the pipe, or the lower side of that pipe, being a bit darker and the top part being lighter, and creating some contrast with the background. And as you can see now, I'm using one of these harder pencils. These are silky black pencils, which are kind of a mixture of charcoal and some other binders, and they're very similar to colored pencils in the way they are applied and the way they feel when you use them. And I'm using these for some of the details on the face and for the shading process. So I did the mouth and the tongue, and you can see that I'm also using my blending tools quite a bit. Sometimes I don't even bother shading certain areas. When I have a bit of charcoal to work with on the paper, I just lift up that charcoal using a brush and move it to other places. That's one of the things that I like to do. It saves time, and it's very convenient and easy, and it kind of feels natural because you just use a dirty brush that already has some charcoal on it, and you just apply it to some of the lighter areas, adding a bit of value as needed. I'm working on the other eye, and of course this area in between the eyebrows and the transition between the eyebrow area and the nose. These are some of the main parts of the face to consider if you want to capture the likeness. But there's still a lot of shading to be done on the face itself, and of course most of it isn't even covered with any amount of value, so obviously I'm going to have to work on it a little bit, first with a brush and later with my pencils, using a combination of a tapered stroke and some cross hatching. I reinforced some of the shadows in those parts of the face which are facing away from the light source, like for example the eye socket area, especially under the eyebrows, the lower part of the nose around the nostrils, the part in between the cheeks and the mouth, and of course under the chin, under the jaw, and on the sides of the face, because the sides of the face are kind of tucked in between the hair and the head, and they're going to be in the shadow, they're going to be a little bit darker. It's always important to shade the sides of the face, otherwise the face will end up looking too wide and too flat, which may not be such a bad thing when you're drawing hobbits, because most of them have kind of wide faces, or at least that's the way they were described in the book. But I'm trying to capture a certain degree of likeness with Martin Freeman, the actor from the Hobbit movie. I'm doing a bit of additional shading on the cheek and cheekbone area, trying to make the cheekbone area stand out a little bit. Notice that before I started shading, I actually went over it gently with a brush. That's one of the things that I like to do. I already mentioned that I like to just use a brush to move a little bit of charcoal, move a little bit of that material from those darker areas onto the lighter areas, and that just helps me shade some of the larger, lighter areas very easily without actually having to use the pencil too much, or at least without having to use it too much in that initial stage where I'm laying down the base stone. And then of course I can later go back in with a pencil, defining the topography of the face and defining some of the details. I'm adding a bit more value on the neck as well, because the neck area really needs to be a lot darker than the face and the chin area. That's one of the things that where inexperienced artists often make mistakes, and this has happened to me as well. The lower part of the face and the neck area sometimes ends up being too light while it should be darker, especially the neck area, which is kind of tucked in under the jaw area and is hidden, not completely hidden away from the light source obviously, but is further away from the light source, and there's always a little bit of shadow being cast from the jaw area, and that's why this part of the body is going to be a little bit darker, especially in that area where the jaw meets the neck. And of course I can add some suggestions of neck muscles and some wrinkles on the neck and some things like that, some smaller details that My camera may not be able to pick up at this point, but I'll zoom in and resharpen, refocus it a little bit so that you can see some of the details. Once that is done, I can do a bit more shading on the lower side of the face. Sometimes it's actually quite often it's easier for me to shade a bit of the neck first and then go back to the face. I just find that shading that darker area first gives me a better idea how much value I actually need on the other parts of the face. And the same goes with the background, because you see, when you have a slightly darker background, as is the case here, I know I have some lighter portions of the background obviously, but I have some quite dark portions of the background because of those trees and the foliage. So one of the things that can happen in those cases is that you shade the background, if you shade the background after you've done drawing your main subject, your main character, the main subject can often end up looking flat, and some of the values which you thought were visible and some of that range of value which you thought would really make the subject stand out ends up being inadequate, ends up not being enough. That's why I like to add at least a little bit of the background so that I can see how dark the main subject will have to be and how light some of the lighter parts of the main subject will have to be. Generally, I like to reserve the lightest lights and the darkest darks for whatever it is that I want to bring into focus, but that doesn't always have to be the case. So right now here I'm still in the process of refining the appearance of the face and refining some of the facial features. This is a process that can take a little bit more time or a little bit less depending on how it's going, depending on the quality of your reference photo and things like that. My reference photo in this case is not bad, it's just that the facial expression makes things a little bit more challenging here, and also a part of the face is obscured by the pipe, and of course there's also that messy hair to worry about. So there are a number of challenges here, but so far I think it's going well because I managed to define some of the main parts of the shape of that face. And the reason why I haven't finished all of the hair as well is because I like to work from left to right to prevent smudging, because I'm right-handed. So if I if I did the hair first and then moved on to the face, I would actually have to, there would actually be a bit more smudging. So I preferred not to do that just yet, and I wanted to finish the face first. And the hair looks kind of light now. He almost looks kind of light, like a light brown, maybe even blonde hair. But that's going to get darker as I start working a bit more on the hair on the right side, because his hair is mostly brown as far as I can tell. But what I wanted to say is that the light is coming more from, or at least when it comes to the hair, the light is coming more from the left side. Because there's an opening in between those trees, so the light is coming through there. So the top part of the head and the top left part of the head is going to be a little bit lighter. And of course his hair is, like I said, a little bit longer, so I try to define its hair, its shape a bit more, especially around the area where around the neck and the shoulders. But right now I'm ready to move on with a little bit more of the background, because I've done most of the work on the face. So once that is done, I can do a little bit more of the background so that I can finish things with the hair as well. And the reason why I need the background is so that I can establish contrast between the right side of the hair and the background. I'm just adding a bit more suggestions of that foliage in the background and adding a bit more value. I'm adding these short marks that imitate the appearance of foliage, And the way that I'm doing this is I'm actually varying both the size of those marks as well as the shape and the direction of those marks, so that I can make it look as organic as possible and so that they actually look like leaves. But I will soften their edges a little bit with a brush because I don't want them to be too defined. The background should be slightly out of focus here. I don't want it to be too distracting. I don't want to produce any texture that would compete with my main subject. Notice that I also added a bit of charcoal powder on the right. The reason why I did that was because I thought that the vine charcoal that I laid down wouldn't be too dark, so I'm going to blend in some charcoal powder as well. That's going to make this part of the drawing a bit darker, and that's going to give me something to work with, because you can't create lighter portions or highlights without having some darker bits to work with and to take some value away from. So I added a bit more vine charcoal as well. I pushed that vine charcoal and that charcoal powder around, creating some suggestions of some darker bits or shadow areas in between those clusters of leaves, those clumps of foliage. And after that I started drawing some lighter areas simply using my brush, because when you use a clean brush or a relatively clean brush, it will actually lift up a little bit of charcoal, and I'm just using these small pencil or rather brush strokes to lift up a bit of charcoal and to make some suggestions of leaves. And eventually I went in and pulled some highlights using a pencil eraser as well, but I used the pencil eraser very sparingly because, like I said, I don't want too much contrast and too much detail in the background. I don't really care whether the background looks well defined and whether you can discern all of the details in the background. I'm mostly concerned with my main subject, and I'm mostly using the background to provide some kind of context for the main character and to create some contrast with lighter bits, and to be able to create a bit more depth in my scene. So I did a bit more work with that pencil eraser, creating some more highlights, and after that the hair will be pretty much done. I'm just going over some of these parts of the foliage, both on the left and the right, trying to decide how much value and how much variation in value I actually want to keep. But like I said, I just mostly don't really care too much if it looks very detailed or defined. I'm moving on to the midground and the foreground here, adding a bit more suggestions of grass and foliage. And after that it's time to move on with the Bilbo's clothes. He is wearing some kind of a vest which has a pretty complex pattern on it, but before I start drawing that pattern, that floral design, I'm just going to have to shade the entire vest first. I'm going to use vine charcoal, which was so useful for me so far, and I'm just going to blend that or spread that with a brush. Add a bit more darker value at the bottom where there is a bit more shadow. Define some of the wrinkles in that vest and in the clothes around it to make everything look more natural, to make everything look more three-dimensional, like it has some more volume and like it's not just a two-dimensional object, but like it's actually a piece of clothing which is being worn by a living creature. So just some suggestions of creases and movement and things like that. And I'm softening everything with a brush, pulling some highlights using a pencil eraser. And once I have that range of value established, and once I have those larger shapes established, I'm going to start working on those details. Here I just decided to add a few more details to these sleeves of his shirt, adding some shadow areas. The shirt is white, very light color, very few details, discernible details here, but there are some folds in the sleeves as well. So I'm putting down a bit of shadow in between them, and again trying to clean up some of the edges and define some of the lighter bits using a pencil eraser. So I wanted to do at least a bit of work on that sleeve on the left before I start drawing all of those details on the vest, because I don't normally put in a lot of work into the clothes, but here I suppose I can't avoid it, so I'm gonna have to just be a little bit more patient and put in a little more work on his clothes. And I'm starting to work on those details. I'm going to be doing most of these with this harder pencil, drawing a whole bunch of these leaves and stems and flowers and petals or whatnot. Don't really know what all of these shapes are. I'm just drawing something similar to what I see in the reference. And notice how some of these marks, some of these details are getting darker and darker near the bottom of the vest, and at the top of the vest they're a lot lighter because they're closer to the light source, and the ones which are further down are in the shadow. So I'm going to do the same thing on the right side, except here the whole right side will have to be a bit darker. I'm doing a little bit more work on these buttons as well, making them a little bit more shiny, like they're made out of metal. So I need a bit more contrast in them between the lighter bits and darker bits. And I kind of skipped over a good part of me drawing his vest. I'm just going to add a bit more of these, of the darker here on the right side, because I didn't really like the contrast, and I'm just making that part of the face a bit darker. So I've done most of the work on the clothes and the face. Now I'm just going to draw some details and textures and do a bit of shading on the hand holding the pipe. A few quick words about the movie as well. Martin Freeman was a decent choice for the role of Bilbo, a good actor too. But the movie itself is vastly inferior to the book, obviously. Not just because books are always better than the movies, but because here the makers of the movie didn't really care much about the plot of the book. So there's that. I had to mention that as well. But the movie is visually impressive and has some good music. I'm just finishing some details on the pipe and the hand. This is also a good time to mention my Patreon. If you want to see more content and longer videos, you should definitely check out my Patreon. You'll find dozens of full-length and real-time videos there. And here on YouTube, if you like my videos, don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to give me a like and comment on my videos. I'm wrapping things up with this drawing, and I just have to decide where to put my signature. I'm going to put it in the lower right corner. And now the drawing is finished. I hope you enjoyed the drawing process. Thank you for watching, and I'm going to see you in the next video. Bye for now.